Welcome, everyone, to Ladder Daily Digest. We honor creators, and we have a creator that has been on lots of different shows before, and we're happy to have him on our show today, Lee Krähenbühl.
Hello, Lee.
Hi, how are you?
Great. And what's kind of unique about you, Lee, is that you are very interested in Mormon topics, although you have not ever been a Mormon. But you've
But he
got some
does,
family history there, and it's a
that's
subject
right.
of interest for you,
I was
right?
going to
It
say, he does know a Mormon.
A couple.
yes, and actually, it was Maven herself who introduced me to the term "never Mormon," "never Mo," and I have made a terrible, terrible joke since I teach at a college near Baltimore, and of course, Baltimore is the home of Edgar Allan Poe. So, quote the Raven, never Mormon.
There you go.
Well, I could have delivered that a whole lot more effectively, but yes, I am a never Mormon. I have very, very deep Mormon ancestry. Or the only effective way to talk about it these days, what with um, some folks being forbidden to use the adjective Mormon or the noun Mormon.
Yeah.
I just refer to everything as the restoration movements, because I have three flavors of restoration movements in my ancestry, as I did not discover until I was in my 30s. I was a young theater historian and I got really interested in genealogy, and I went to Nauvoo because I had some hints through my father's mother's family that they had been Mormon. And my grandmother knew about it, but she didn't know much about it. Um, it seems that religious traditions uh, are like businesses, or in my family, it used to be said that it takes 7 generations to build a farm, but only 1 generation to lose it.
Oh,
What I'm finding is that family traditions, family lore, um, the intergenerational transmission of narrative is like that, and religious traditions are like that as well.
Hmm.
And what I discovered is that I have one strain of my ancestral lineage who were with the Latter-day Saints since 1831. They were converted in Ohio by Zebedee Coltrane and Levi Hancock, and they were in Kirtland. They went to Far
Very
West.
early on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very early on, and they followed
Before all
Joseph.
the various splittings. Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
before all the various splittings, and they followed the main body of the Latter-day Saints to Nauvoo. They were there when Joseph and Hiram were martyred, and they followed Brigham Young to the Great Basin. And there's another strain of family who were the next generation, and were part of that group who were split over the issue of polygamy.
Hmm.
And they became RLDS, Reorganized Latter-day Saints, now the Community of Christ. Um, and there was a third that I discovered that my family is very close to, who did not follow the main body over to Nauvoo. They stayed in Caldwell County, Missouri. And one of them married one of the RLDS ancestors, and that's a whole new mixture. Um,
A whole other
so
story.
I knew something about all of this. I knew that, for example, my grandmother had a grandfather, my second great grandfather, whose name was Joseph Smith Lee. And I thought, oh, well, that's kind of a coincidence. It wasn't a coincidence at all. He wasn't named Joseph Smith Lee because his parents admired Joseph Smith. He was named Joseph Smith Lee because his parents knew Joseph Smith. His father's name was Alfred Lee. And it's through that I have a third cousin named Harold B. Lee.
Oh,
And it's that same guy about whom I have uh, various feelings and opinions, because he is the president of the church who decided that Nauvoo would no longer be a site that would be restored in the manner of Williamsburg, because it was the same team.
mhm.
Stanley Kimball brought in the same team that had restored some buildings in colonial Williamsburg, and what they wanted was for historic Nauvoo to be run by the National Park Service, and for it to be that kind uh,
Yeah.
of
So wait,
historical
I
site.
might be lost here. So when you're saying Harold B. Lee, you're talking about the president of the Brighamite LDS Church.
That's
So
correct.
that your third cousin is Harold B. Lee, like that one, not just
Yes,
happily like.
third
Okay.
cousin, twice removed.
Okay.
There you go. And
And
here's one thing
yeah,
I'll say. My
yes.
sister-in-law is the grandniece, so we're related, Lee.
So we are. I knew that
You
was going
know?
to happen. I
Yeah.
knew that was going to happen. I was for a time a minister in the Church of the Brethren, which is one of the historic peace churches, and they had something they called the Brethren name game, and eventually they would kind of uh, there there there's this tradition of finding some connection there until they realized what degree of Kevin Bacon that they
Yeah,
were
I was gonna say
related.
there's like that 7 degrees of separation kind of a thing,
Yes.
and then
Yeah.
in certain communities, I think it's much smaller, and I think
Yeah.
Mormonism is one of them. Yeah, just keep it down to 4 or 3 even. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So I do have ancestry that flows in those directions, but as an historian, I have an interesting take on it because I have sources of information that aren't really connected directly with the faith tradition, but are deeply connected with the ancestry.
Mhm.
And so I've been able to draw from various sources in my own family. And I've been looking into this fella, Joseph Smith Lee Sr. He was born in 1839 and he died in 1922. And it turns out that, um, well,
This
we'll
is a
get into that a little
yeah,
later
I
when
was
we
gonna say
start the presentation.
yeah, I think I know, if I recall correctly, our previous conversation, a
Yeah.
very, very interesting character for sure. So does that
That's
is
right.
that part of today's presentation, or does that segue into it,
we
or should
we
we just
touch
abrupt?
we touch on him as an example of
Okay.
what we call fabulation, um, which is is simply it's a very fancy term for making stuff up.
Okay.
And
Okay.
so
Let me
so
pull it
what
up
we're going to
here.
be there we
Yeah,
go.
go ahead. Give us
Okay.
the
I'm going to say a
introduction.
joke about fabulation really quickly is
Oh,
that
please do.
Lee and I are so old that we talk about the 7 degrees of separation of Francis Bacon.
That's a good one.
I I'm gonna I'm
13th
completely
century philosopher.
I'm completely stealing that.
Awesome.
Now that we're family, it's not really stealing.
There you go.
Yeah, this is we're going to be talking about the distinctions among myth and legend and fact and how historians tell them apart and why that matters. Because right now we are in a political situation in which the lines among myth and legend and fact that have always separated those in the scientific mind are being blurred, erased, conflated, um, and really we're being told that they don't matter that much,
And
but they matter.
these will
Go
be
ahead.
transferable skills, right? Like we'll be able
It,
to tell if the flat earth is a myth or a legend or a fact after we
yes,
get
yes,
these
we
skills.
after we get these skills, well, even before we get these skills, but that's another matter altogether. That has to do with fabulation too. So if we can have the next slide.
Yep.
All right.
Maybe. Oh, here we go.
It's just being very sluggish. So we have a problem. We have a challenge here. And the challenge has to do with this question: did this really happen? And I'm going to use as an example a pervasive legend among Latter-day Saints, and it has to do with Joseph Smith's connection to theater. There is a fact that I didn't know until I began my research in both theater and among the Latter-day Saints at the same time, and that fact is that the Latter-day Saints are the earliest English-speaking religious community to sanction the theater as something that it was okay to participate in. There is
Okay.
no other English speaking religious group that thought that that was okay. Being
And why? Could you just touch on that real quick?
it there were a lot of there was so much there was so much ambivalence about going to the theater in colonial America that all the theaters in colonial America were closed during the Revolution.
Hmm.
The Society of Friends, the Quakers, thought that theater was a satanic temptation toward an indulgence in the sensibilities
Okay. So just like
rather than in
anything
sense.
new then, or
Yeah,
maybe not necessarily new, but anything fun.
well, it was anything fun.
Dancing, music, anything that might get you
Alcohol,
feeling some
anything
feelings.
fun.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that it's a bit much. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, that makes
So
sense
so
then.
the Quakers of Philadelphia spent generations fighting the institution of theater. They only had one problem during the revolution, and that was that and then immediately after the revolution, and that was that President George Washington loved to go to the theater. It was one of his favorite things to do. And so eventually, both before and after the revolution, there were theaters established in Philadelphia. Um, the so-called the founders attended them, both men and women attended the theaters, and but no religious body thought that that was a good idea. It
Okay.
was sort of like going to a strip club. The ideas around that we have today. Was it legal? Sure, it was completely legal. You couldn't be arrested for going into a theater. Is it something that you would tell one of your church-going friends that you did on a regular basis? No,
Hmm.
no,
Hmm.
probably not. It would not give you a good social reputation.
Hmm. That's interesting.
And yeah, well, what's very interesting is that um, is this legend that grew up around the founding of theater. First of all, um, well, why don't you go ahead and hit the next click?
Yeah.
And I'm going to highlight
Mm,
a
sorry.
good. That's all right. Okay, the prophet Joseph Smith introduced theater introduced theater into Nauvoo. Um, and he formed a dramatic company. That's what this particular part of the legend said. That Joseph Smith was the one who introduced theater to Nauvoo, and he himself personally formed a dramatic company. Now there was a
Okay.
dramatic company in Nauvoo in 1844. Veteran actor Thomas A. Line um, was converted to the church in Philadelphia and came to Nauvoo. The legend goes on that it was Joseph Smith who called this professional actor Thomas A. Line to Nauvoo, and that's how theater got started.
Restart.
So, yeah, so this legend has persisted into the present day. Uh, this is an article from the Church News, and and here's a quote from Brother Adams of a theater company. Joseph Smith started theater in the church, he said. Not many people know that. He sanctioned the Nauvoo Dramatic Association. Okay, now remember that word or that term for the theatrical company.
Sanctioned.
Big,
Yeah,
well,
the
not
company.
just sanctioned. Sanctioned is an important word too, but the name Nauvoo Dramatic Association
All
or
right.
New
Initials are
Dramatics
also NDA, so we'll come to
NDA.
that later.
And there's a problem with that, and there's a reason that not many people know that, and the reason is because it's not true. So here are the two parts of the legend. The first legend is Joseph Smith started the theater in the church. And the second part of the legend is the company he sanctioned was called the Nauvoo Dramatic Association. And is that myth? Is that legend? Is that fact? Well, it's certainly fact adjacent, but it's not the way things happened. Next animation. And by by way of making this point, I want to talk about two theologians named Karl Barth and Paul Tillich. And they were friends. One was Protestant, one was Catholic. They were um, they had there was a lot of controversy between them about the various views they held. But one story that's told in seminaries all over North America and in Europe had to do with them being at the same conference and going to dinner together and disputing and disputing and disputing. And the legend goes that they walked to the Strassenbahn stop together, and that Tillich and Bart were going to part ways. Tillich was talking with Bart, just as an example, about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and he was saying, it's supposedly the church where that is in the tomb or adjacent to the tomb where Jesus was raised from the dead.
Yeah.
Next
I've been
animation,
there.
please.
Yeah.
Have you really? Okay, you'll
It's in
recognize this.
Jerusalem, right?
It's in Jerusalem. You'll
Yeah.
recognize this then.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
there is an altar, and it says verbum caro hic factum est. Here the word was made flesh. And Tillich said, okay, verbum, word of God, yes, caro factum, we can each agree in our own way, but hic? And his point was, here? You mean this actually happened, Carl? Can you
Mm,
really actually believe this in something other than metaphor? And Bart responded this way. You see, Paulus, that's the difference between you and me. I must have my little hic. What he was saying was, it really matters whether it really happened. Tillich was very much of the mind that the mythos, the grand narrative of Christianity, was largely metaphorical, and it truly didn't matter whether certain things actually were historically accurate. And to Bart, it mattered very much. I must have my little hic. Well, historians are like that. We have to have our little hicks. We have to know whether or not this is historical fact or whether it's myth, which is a grand narrative that takes parts of the fact and weaves them into something deeper, more meaningful, that says something to us about our lives. Or is it simply legend? Is it something that's pretty much made up out of whole cloth? It's a story that builds over the generations.
okay. I agree. And to kind of go back to what you were saying earlier, just we're seeing again in today's climate where these things matter because I think I guess there are certain things that maybe a belief in or against may not affect reality or have anything to do about reality. But when those
Yeah.
beliefs really do, and I think that's kind of where we're at, they do affect our reality. Believing something that's not true doesn't make it true, but it does
Yes.
affect behavior and how we how things can show up in reality. So yeah.
Exactly. And it matters if you keep if you know something is not true, or it doesn't matter to you whether it's true or not, and you keep repeating it over and over and over and over again, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and pretty soon we begin to doubt our grasp on reality.
Yeah.
My point and my belief is that it's important. It's important to know um, whether something really happened or not. That facts matter. That facts are important, and they're
Yeah.
more important than legend, and they're more important than mythos. That it's it really matters whether we know that something happened or not, especially when we're basing the mythos on the fact.
Yeah.
S-
Okay.
Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. I'll give a little background to whether this particular problem really happened, and so we'll move into some principles behind the legend that Joseph Smith started theater in the church, and the other legend as well.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So this is what I've found over the last 30 years of looking into it, because originally I thought that because I did not have a personal background in the restoration movements, that I really didn't have any business looking into it. And so I dug and I dug and I dug and I asked people who had, and what I found was an extremely curious phenomenon, and that is that uh, people who are faithful members of the Latter-day Saints, of the Brighamites, really don't care all that much about whether or not these two legends are actually something that happened, right down to the theater departments in major universities. My first finding was that Joseph Smith served only as an audience member for the first theatrical performances among the Latter-day Saints, which again are the
Hmm.
earliest religiously sanctioned performances in the English language. And secondly, the company that he supposedly sanctioned, was called the Nauvoo Dramatic Association. The name Nauvoo Dramatic Association or Society dates no earlier than 50 years after the company actually existed. And the company to which the name refers was founded not by Joseph Smith, but by Thomas A. Line.
Okay. So it's gotten conflated over time.
It's right. What happened is that after the turn of the century, what people did remember is that there was this thing called the Deseret Dramatic Society, and the Deseret, sometimes called the Deseret Dramatic Association, and that got conflated back into the NDA. And it's an extremely there's a very simple, a deceptively simple explanation for why that happened, but we'll get to that a little further on.
And
Um,
also say that it would make sense to people because Joseph Smith was the mayor, the
yes,
general, the
yes.
He
postmaster.
always had to be the center of attention.
He did
Uh, the
everything in Nauvoo anyway.
the
And
the
so,
president the presidential candidate.
yeah, if so,
Yes,
if somebody suggested it, it would make some
Yeah.
reasonable sense, right?
Joseph
exactly.
Smith,
Believe it.
I guess we would call it main character energy or
Yeah.
like star of the show. Diva,
Yes.
maybe.
Yes. Yes. Uh, BDE, big dogma energy, I think would probably be the
There.
way to put that. Um, but I'd like to bring one of the historian Douglas Brinkley's sayings to our attention. And he said, "We abandon chronology at our own peril as historians." He got it from his professor, Stephen Archer. The idea here is that if we cannot place something in time and place a year, and if we can possibly do it, a date on it, then it's very, very doubtful that it's historically accurate, or at least an era.
Okay.
Things happen in real time. Historical facts, historical events happen in an order. in chronological order. One thing gives rise to the next thing, and those two things are related to a third thing that happens later on. And so when we ask, did that really happen? We mustn't abandon chronology, and yet that's what we do a lot when we're talking about anything having to do with history in general and history among the Latter-day Saints in particular.
Yeah, I
And
would say. I
yeah,
think especially a lot of the narratives that I grew up with about how the Book of Mormon came or
mhm.
to be written, and then especially the priesthood, I think was a really jarring one for me. The timeline and the chronology on that is not at all what I was taught that it was. So
Ah,
yeah,
uh-huh.
I suspect
Yes.
that it's things like that that you're referring to.
It is things that like that that I'm referring to. And when I first got to Nauvoo, and I'll show you the building that actually sucked me into the vortex of wanting to know about this stuff. It's really the vital question to historians. And we're talking here about historiographical method, because there are certain rules that we follow when we're looking at history. There's a very distinguished uh, professor of Christian history. He's an expert in the New Testament. He is, and he's. It startled me when I discovered a couple of years ago that he's also somebody quoted a lot by um, by defenders, apologists for the historicity of the Book of Mormon.
Oh,
Because yeah, and
I did not know Bart Ehrman.
Bart Ehrman.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
no, he's quoted a lot by by people who want to prove the historicity of the Book of Mormon.
Hmm.
Um, so Ehrman says this: the historical disciplines are not like the natural sciences. They cannot operate through repeated experimentation, and the historian can only look at evidence available in the public record. And it follows. Well, what follows is this definition of historiography: the writing of history based on the critical examination of sources, the selection of particulars from the authentic materials, and the synthesis of particulars into a narrative that will stand the test of critical methods. So when we go to the next animation, we separate those out. Those three criteria are often lacking in the accounts that we are most familiar with: the critical examination of sources,
Hmm.
critical examination being the key. How
Yeah.
critically are we looking at the sources? The selection of particulars from the authentic materials, meaning uh, the 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 real stuff, the primary documents or primary accounts, and the synthesis of those into a narrative that will stand the test of critical methods. So there's an
Can I?
actual methodology. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. I wanted to know if I could maybe give an example that's just more like recently on my mind is a Mormon
Okay.
Stories episode covering an apologist for the church trying to, I guess, defend the Book of Mormon from the accusation of racism, especially problematic passages
Oh,
about white skin being beautiful, being delightsome, being pure, and just, associated with good, versus a curse of black skin, which is literally what's there in the text. And this apologist went through great lengths to talk about all the ways that the curse of black skin
yeah.
was not necessarily a curse and not necessarily black and not necessarily skin, bringing up clothing, bringing up tattoos, bringing up face paint or body paints,
Hmm.
and trying to use historical sources, from Mayan culture to cover that and say that there's, good, maybe good reason to believe that this was talking about, this. But then when you look at the other parts of the Book of Mormon, that use the same phrase, it won't match
Hmm.
up. So if it's,
Right.
if the skin of blackness means body paint, then the scripture, the verse that says that God cursed them with black skin so they would uh, not be attractive basically to the
Yeah.
white people, that doesn't really work
Or
for body
generational.
paint. Yeah.
Yes. And
Yeah.
let's not just pin that tail on the donkey of Latter-day Saint theology, that
Yeah.
was a popular view in the 19th and 18th and 17th and 16th century. It comes from the story of Noah getting drunk in his tent and his
Right.
sons seeing his nakedness and making fun of him, and then Noah cursing, it's a whole it's a racist strain within the Bible.
Yeah.
And then if
And
you can
if
point
we're
to that context, then you could say
yeah,
that proves the meaning was skin, not
yes, yeah,
Right. And
tattoos.
that's how it would have been understood by
that's how
those
it would have been
people. Yeah.
understood. That's
Right.
correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So we take all of these elements. This is something a little bit about my the mentors I studied under
Okay.
at Linfield College and the University of Vienna, which is where I met my lovely wife. At the Graduate Theological Union and the University of Oregon, where I did my PhD. And if we go to the next animation, all of this adds up to the disciplines that I combine when I do all of this work together: theater history, genealogy, and canon criticism, meaning the looking at the actual canon of the scriptures that we're looking at. And so when we grind these up in the next animation, those go through the funnel and they become my particular historiographical method. And you notice that it's no longer just one color anymore. It's all of those disciplines
Hmm.
together. Um,
So you're not funneling
so
this through an astrophysical lens.
no, no, no. This is just mine.
Okay.
And we all and everybody has their own. This is my particular method. But there is a method to this particular madness. There are four criteria that we use um, traditionally when we look at historiography. Um, and we're looking at history and genealogy and canon criticism. First of all, early date. Is the source close in time to the event? Is the source that we're using to ground this in history close in time? Closer in time, the
Like,
more likely probably authentic. The
okay. Like
next
newspaper
criteria,
articles or journals of the day
right,
around that
right,
time. Yeah.
and
Contemporaneous.
yeah, contemporaneous sources. That's exactly right. I love that word. The next is contextual credibility. Does it make sense within the time that we know it to be? For example, if we had a letter that was ostensibly written by Abraham Lincoln, and the date was right because we knew that we had tested the paper, and the paper could be dated to roughly to the 1860s, the kind of ink, if it looked like his handwriting, and it said, April 2nd, 1862. Uh, my dear friend, what's up, dog?
Yes.
Um, it doesn't meet the second criterion because it's not contextually credible. That's not something that he would have said. And in the next animation, we come across a third criterion: dissimilarity. And that has to do with whether the account stands in contrast over against the expected self-interest of the source.
Hmm.
If the source would be, if it's problematic to the source, if it's not something that the source uh, would rather not say, but it actually happened, it's true, so they have to disclose it. The more dissimilar it is from vested interests,
Hmm.
the more likely it's probably true. And
Okay.
I want to give a shout out to Dr. Ehrman because he puts this so much more beautifully and eloquently than I do in his own work. But the fourth that
Well,
he
before we go
brings
on
up,
to that, would that say
sure,
this reminds me of, I think, a lot of apologetics in general Christianity, and they call it the maybe they don't use the word criterion, but of embarrassment. I think a criterion of embarrassment, to say, like,
Yeah.
if something embarrassing is being disclosed, then that's why this would or wouldn't be here. I still think
Yeah.
they apply it problematically, maybe in assuming the types of things that would or would not be embarrassing, or maybe overlook
Right.
the self-service of this fact. And
Yeah.
I think so that's what you're talking about here. Not so much that it's because I think it's not so much whether something is embarrassing or not that makes it more or less true, but like you said, the self-interest in telling it, because
Yeah.
there are times and places where, yeah, it is a good thing to reveal something that seems embarrassing. And I'm actually thinking, going back to an interview I did with Stephen Pinecker, where he's talking about big evangelicals, like it's almost, you always have to have this like down in the dump story where you were a drug addict or a prostitute, or you were
Yeah.
sleeping in a car, or you woke up coked up on the side of the road across the country. These things are embarrassing, but they give
Right.
street smarts or credibility to pastors. So
Yes.
there's actually a benefit to sharing this rather than embarrassment.
We have to make a distinction between dissimilarity and shaming.
Hmm.
And the fact that when it's to the narrator's benefit that they come from a low, shameful position and they're lifted up
Right.
through their conversion, that's something different. That's different than the self-interest of the narrator. You're spot on
Okay.
with that. Yeah,
Okay. All right.
it's a
And
really
then,
good distinction. It's a useful distinction to make.
all
And
right,
so the
number
third
4.
criterion is multiple independent attestation. Do we have multiple sources that look at all of these things that happen from a slightly different point of view? And do they not rely on each other? Are they aware of each other, or are they, or did one talk to the other and they were trying to get
Mm,
their story straight?
okay.
Um, and so as we go into the next animation, we see that it's most likely to have happened when when two, at least two of these overlap. But in the crowning animation here, it's most likely to have happened when all of these criteria are fulfilled.
Okay.
So let's go ahead and apply this to these legends that we're looking at.
Yes. All righty.
Okay. Now, it's human nature to rewrite our narratives. And if this is familiar in our current societal situation, so much the better. It's human nature to rewrite our narratives to suit what we wish or we imagine had happened rather than what actually happened. The result is called variously legend, mythos, grand narrative, but by whatever name, it does not accurately record historical reality. Rather, the rewrites we do on our narratives, and we all do them, reflect our nostalgia, which filters out unwanted information to produce a version of the story shaped to our ideal. Is this sounding familiar?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Um, um, Nancy, my wife, and I went to Montpelier, which was James Madison's plantation, one of the founders, and they have done just an absolutely stellar job in bringing the voices of the enslaved people of that plantation to the fore. And part of one of the enslaved people's stories that they have so artfully set up in a restored basement of the main house. This quote is by Reggie Gibson, who's a performer and educator, and he says in one of these in one of these historical displays, history is an indictment of nostalgia, and we don't like to be indicted.
Hmm.
So, and he said that, of course, in the context of slavery, of the institution of slavery. We don't like to think of our founders as people who were so cruel as to enslave other people. Now, if you've done any genealogical work at all, you know how upset your newfound cousins get when you bring up the subject of slavery. Sometimes, oh no, my family never had anything to do with slavery.
Hmm.
Or yeah, I mean, that's perfectly logical if your family was here after,
Yeah.
1870 or so. But for those of us who have ancestry way, way, way back, um, uh, we are of two kinds. Most of us have at least some of our ancestors who were enslavers or benefited from slavery, and all of us who are Americans benefited from the institution of slavery, and we have to cope with that. We have to come to
Hmm.
terms with it. If we don't, it's not accurate information. It's the difference between something called the 1619 Project and something called the 1776 Project. But this not being a political discussion, I'll just back off of that.
I am wondering, would this also I mean, maybe apply to something like women in the church?
Yes.
And maybe this isn't quite what you're going for, but I know as a member, I would reduce the harm and the sexism when it was called out by people, and now on the outside, I'm feel like I'm more able to be accurate to things. Is
Yeah.
that like this, or is that maybe a little bit different?
Oh, it is
Um,
not a bit different at all.
okay, all right.
It is not. No, you're spot on there. Um, is it okay for minor girls to be married to older men in the institution of polygamy? Was that okay?
I mean, it was
Um,
then, but
was uh, it
to some, I
was
guess.
insert right to
Yeah.
some. That's but to romanticize it and say, "Oh, it was great. It's fantastic. Everybody had a great time in polygamy." My family is a witness to the fact that polygamy destroyed families. Oh, just over and above the tragic fact that young women and girls were married off to older men. Joseph Smith Lee became an anti-polygamist evangelist and did as much direct battle with Brigham Young as he possibly could in the late 1860s and 1870s. That wasn't what divided the family. What divided the family was the fact that some sided with their father taking a plural wife, and some sided against their father taking a plural wife, and it absolutely destroyed that family. So as we go on from there, we can remember that there's a very sharp distinction. It's a very sharp sword that divides nostalgia from from actual history. We don't like to be indicted.
To a lot of people, it wasn't the good old days.
Right, exactly. And what do we call that? We call that fabulation, the little pink word in the corner. Here he is. This is Joseph Smith Lee Sr., my second great grandfather. I am close enough to him to have sources that come directly from people who knew him, my grandmother, my great grandmother. And I have enough historical distance not to have known him and not to have been close to the family that stayed close to him. And I'll explain that a little bit more a little bit later. But I'd like to appeal to the Catholic historian Raymond E. Brown, who brings up when in his he wrote a terrific book called The Birth of the Messiah. And in it, he says right off the bat, there's a difference between history and tradition. Not all traditions are historical. And what's the difference between historical tradition and ahistorical tradition? Well, it's this thing, fabulation, again at the bottom. And um, I found a lot of fabulation when I started looking into his life story. The difference between history, which is a careful construction with available evidence, and tradition, which is received material that's been adjusted, it's been augmented in each iteration. Every time it's repeated, it's fabulated a little bit, it changes a little bit, um, not in any way that is malicious, but in a way that addresses the biases and the agenda of the person who's telling the story.
The fish gets a little
And
bit bigger each time.
yes, or smaller, depending on whether you're talking to the person you want to impress with the size of the fish, or you're talking to the game warden
Right.
who is telling you that you shouldn't have fished there in the first place. So
Got
as
it.
we
Yeah.
move on, so what happened was that I discovered the biography of Joseph Smith Lee Sr.,
Hmm.
again, 1839 to 1922, in a biography that was published by the Samuel Lee Family Historical Association. And who was the president for a short time before he was president of the Latter-day Saints?
Harold B.
Harold B. Lee. Yeah, my third cousin. Um, and what I found was that there were a lot of stories about him, and I a lot of it just didn't ring true, and I didn't have any direct evidence yet, except this book. This was the first piece of evidence that I found in genealogies. There are a lot of biographies, and this particular biography had lacunae in it. A lacuna it's the Latin word for lake. It's a gap in our knowledge.
Okay.
If we have a manuscript and there's a big hole in it, and we have to reconstruct what's in the hole, that's a lacuna. And so as we go on with this particular animation, traditional sources are inherently lacunose. That means they have a lot of lacunas in them. They're full of gaps and they're prone to fabulation. And if you hit the next click, you'll see what happens to the lacuna, that hole in the narrative there.
Mm,
And what happens with fabulation, it just sort of fills in the gap. It's
mm,
like paint or spackle. Anyone who's moved in and out of a house or a college dorm room knows that you've got to restore it and you've got to repaint it and you've got to fill those holes. And sometimes those holes are really, really big. And you see that it takes a lot of spackle, and you just hope that nobody puts a pin or a nail in that hole because it's going to disappear into the wall.
yeah.
So what I found was this. We can go into the next slide. So here is the story, all 846 words of his biography in the Samuel Lee Historical Society um, uh, genealogy.
Hmm.
And this is the whole thing.
Okay.
And so what I found was that there are four major lacunae totaling 71 years of his life, meaning um, there were some gaps in there.
But yeah,
And
this is making me think of just the New Testament in general and
sure,
the idea of Jesus. Basically, other than his birth and then one story of him as a child, basically everything up until
mhm,
his ministry is a lacunae, one giant, right?
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yes. W- the first Christians who heard about Jesus were not interested in his life story. They were interested in the passion, in his death and his resurrection, because what Paul had told them was that what they needed to do in order to be saved was to believe on Jesus Christ, and you and your household will be saved. That's all they needed to do.
Yeah.
Eventually, as theologians started thinking these things out, um, they took the Gospel of Mark and thought, "Boy, I wonder where Jesus grew up." And some sources say Nazareth, and some sources say Bethlehem. And what was he doing? And but why is it important for him to be born in Bethlehem? How do we get him from Nazareth to Bethlehem? Well, there was this. There was this tax. There was a proclamation that
A
all the world
census.
should be taxed.
Mm,
We don't have any evidence, any extra biblical evidence of that happening at all. So that is something that is added to the story. Now, I mean no disrespect to folks for whom this is part of the grand narrative. This is part of the mythos. And again, let's understand. I'm not doing theology. I'm doing history. I'm
right.
doing historiography
I
here.
I brought the theology into it. So that was
Yeah.
on me,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, but it's a perfect example. Um, the how do we know about Jesus's early life? People started writing into the second and third centuries. People started writing proto gospels that explained what Jesus was like as a boy, and what they did with Joseph Smith Lee Sr. Was to start to fill those gaps in, because it was a little less innocent on their counts, because
Hmm.
there were things that happened in those 71 years that they didn't particularly want to talk about. There is some talk about he and his brother-in-law, Andrew Blodgett, and who had married his sister. Um, there was some stories about them being interested in the reorganized Latter-day Saints. So he had joined the reorganized Latter-day Saints. They had left their home in Tooele, and they had gone to Missouri. And next thing you know, um, he dies in Ewan, Washington,
Mm.
where he is buried with his wife, Mary Ann, my second great grandmother. Um, 58% of these 846 words are fabulation. Over half things that didn't happen, but in order to make the narrative make sense. And you will find this a lot in, and I can't just say this is among the Latter-day Saints or among the
Right.
Restoration movements. Genealogists do this all the time. If you are confused on FamilySearch.com or on Ancestry.com, you are not alone. There's a lot of fabulation going on, and a lot of the fabulation has to do with wanting to connect oneself with a famous person. And I can't find any evidence for this person's father, but they have the same name. So I'm just going to say that their father and mother were these two people, because it's through these two people that I can be related to the royal family of
Yeah.
England and to Charlemagne.
I
Um,
I wanna know,
and
so,
you can
how you
imagine,
can tell it's
yes.
fabulation or, because when we were talking about, well, like with Jesus,
Mhm,
that there's just this gap in the knowledge, or there's just not anything written there. I mean, in this case, there
yes.
is, but it's filled in after the fact. So how are you able to tell? Like I'm looking at just I think like the third paragraph that's in purple
Mhm.
because Salt Lake City was such a disappointment to him. He wondered how the Lord could require people to live in such a dusty desert as this. So how do you know that's it just I guess is it because of feelings? I guess that's what we're saying here.
It's because it's not based on, uh, we don't, at least I don't, have a letter written in Joseph Smith Lee's hand that says, "I'm really disappointed in this dusty desert."
It's just family
There's also,
folklore.
this is family. Well, it's family folklore, but in the last 30 years, I've been unable to track anyone down who can tell me where that story comes from.
Mm,
Now, there's a lot of white lettering there,
yeah.
and I can verify all of that.
As I'm
But
looking, there's a wedding date, a
yeah,
second child that dies in infancy. So,
yeah,
so these are things that there would be like records for.
those are absolute facts.
Yeah. Okay.
What this narrative leaves out are two very important things. I mean, it leaves out a lot of very important things that I've been able to discover through the generosity of cousins who who have family stories that they passed on to me, and through my grandmother and great grandmother who knew him. But there are two things that happened. One thing that happened was that he became one of the most famous reorganized Latter-day Saint evangelists of the 1870s.
Okay.
He billed himself as someone called Joseph the Rocky Mountain Hunter. He dressed himself in a buckskin jacket with
Yes. Okay.
fringe, and he made it his life's work to destroy Brigham Young. He didn't succeed in that, but he did succeed in getting enough lecture time in a circuit in the mountain states to make several forays into Salt Lake City. And at the point at which the Godbeite movement was the strongest, he was able to be booked at the Liberal Institute and at several Methodist churches to make some pretty vociferous attacks um, on Mormonism. And what he did, not on his kind of Mormonism, he had a sermon called "The True and Counterfeit Mormonism," and he would take this same sermon to anyone who would listen. And he converted a lot of people
Hmm.
from the Brighamites to who the people who would call themselves Josephites, who were the reorganized church. Um, but eventually, his children were either for him or against him in that. My great grandfather, Henry Owen Tobias Lee, who was known as Hank, my grandmother's father, um, became an atheist. And he was a hard rock miner, and he moved to Montana to try to get away from Joseph Smith Lee, his father. And Joseph Smith Lee's ministry in Nebraska wasn't going so well, in Wyoming. And so he followed Hank to the mountains, and they started a hard rock mine, and um, they began to produce gold that counterfeited money.
Wow.
And in
Wait. Gold that counterfeited money?
yeah, they
Okay, so
started
they were
they started
producing
pressing
fake
they
gold.
started pressing U.S. coins
Oh, okay.
out of the gold that they were mining and out of the lead that they were mining
Oh, okay.
in Trout Creek, um, Montana. And in 1909,
So they were
Hank,
Mormon. No, I'm just
they
kidding.
were they I mean you what you're saying is absolutely true. Um, but that's another part of the story that we will get into in another visit.
There you go.
Why he was doing that. But he was doing that. And in 1909, Hank went into um, Sandpoint, Idaho, and passed some of the coins. The coins were recognized as counterfeit. He was pursued by police. He shot at them. He was arrested, and they tracked him. Through him, they tracked Joseph back to his um, what the federal uh, police called his lair in the
Okay.
mountains, and they arrested him
And
and
that's this
his two.
guy.
That's yeah, that's
Okay.
Joseph. Um, and by this time he's an old man. This is 1909. He was born in 1839. He was in his well into his 70s, and he and two of his sons, including my great grandfather, were thrown into Leavenworth for a year and a half. And again, another
Okay.
thing that completely destroyed the family.
So that
But
wouldn't be a
that's not in his.
confabulation. That wouldn't be something that people would brag about. So that must
No,
be true.
Yeah, I'm thinking
yeah,
so that's
it,
missing from this story. Is that right?
it's missing from the story. There's
Yeah.
nothing in the story after him moving to Missouri in the 1860s until 1922 when he dies.
Hmm.
And there are a lot more things that I could point out about this that are complete fabulation, but I only bring this to the fore by saying that things are covered up by fabulation when um, they are embarrassing, when they bring shame upon the family, and when you have a little historical distance from them, and you can say, uh, yes, it was extremely painful. My grandmother never talked about it, uh, beyond the fact that she, as an 8-year-old girl, was called upon to testify at the trial.
Wow.
And that's, yeah, and that's how we knew about all of this stuff. The family was shamed, they were ostracized, they were driven into poverty. Hank
Hmm.
and Elva, my great grandmother, divorced. And there's much more to that story that doesn't have to do with fabulation, because now I'm telling you what actually happened.
Yeah.
But as we move on from this into,
And
um,
actually, Joseph Smith Lee only
yeah,
died a little more than 100 years ago. And there's all
yes,
this
yeah,
confabulation.
yeah,
Just think if somebody lived, say, 2,000 years ago, how
Mhm.
much confabulation there might be by now.
yeah, yeah. The fabulation, every generation, and sometimes within generations, re reimagines, reinvents, fabulates another iteration. And understand that fabulation doesn't mean lying, and it doesn't mean there doesn't have to be any animus behind it. There doesn't have to be any ill intent.
Mm.
What fabulation is making something make sense to the people for whom it is so important that it be covered with nostalgia rather than indictment. Then they
I'm
start to
thinking
make sense of this way. It
this
this
might
way.
be
Go ahead.
more extreme example, but it's also, I think, very instant. So it didn't take, this is a death of an individual recently,
Mm,
and their obituary. There's a man who I think
yeah,
this was Michael Haight in southern Utah. He's a family annihilator. Basically, he was an abusive man. His wife was going to leave him, and he was Mormon. He was very much a part
yeah.
of the community. His initial obituary was pulled down over a lot of controversy because it was, first of all, one of the longest obituaries I've ever read from somebody. Usually, they really summarize, especially when the death, it was a murder
Mm,
suicide. He had murdered his wife, her mother. They had 5 children, and then he killed himself. So we had 8 lives lost,
oh
all from
gosh.
this one man. And this obituary just painted him as this, and it must have been written, of course, by his family. And I think this is how they would have wanted him to be remembered versus,
Mm,
obviously what was in the news. But it was just glowing. Called him a family man.
mm,
Talked about that he loved his wife and children, and also what positions he held in the church and in the community, and
mm,
just overall just really painted out this guy, just again, as I think as his family wanted. Like you said, I don't think it was malicious, but it certainly
yeah,
came across that way, and that's why it ended up being pulled, because it was extremely controversial considering the nature of what he did to his family.
yeah,
But
yeah.
I'm thinking, and again, that doesn't take 100 years. That happened immediately,
No,
when that.
no. And we see it happening in our culture now.
Right.
People simply do not see things in the same way. Human truth is multiple, and we have to contend with that in a variety of ways. And one of the things that brings history alive for me is seeing that human truth is multiple, and that it's not just a matter of getting the chronology right and getting the sources right and figuring out what actually happened, because people who were there are going to see it in a different light.
Mhm.
Um, Now, you asked before about, you remarked on the fact that it was interesting that apologists for the Book of Mormon and for Latter-day Saint theology really like to quote Bart Ehrman, when Bart Ehrman is well, he's a demythologizer, really.
Mhm.
Although he would say, I think to his credit, that he's not setting out to demythologize. He's just a historian working with what he has, and He's looking at what probably happened.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that apologists for the Book of Mormon like to quote him is that he points out the fact, he's built his career on the fact that there are errors in all of the manuscripts that we have. There are discrepancies in all of the biblical manuscripts that we have of the New Testament. And most of them don't make any difference. Some of them make a great deal of difference. And some of them have tried to be, they're the often monks, the scribes who were reproducing these and passing them on to the next generation, often would correct each other's theology. And so
Mm.
there's really no such thing as an original draft of any of these manuscripts. We don't have the original manuscripts. Not only do we not have the original manuscripts, Dr. Ehrman would say,
Yeah.
we don't have copies of them. We don't have copies of the copies. We don't have copies of the copies of the copies of the copies. We
Yeah.
have a few there are hundreds, but we have hundreds of identifiable manuscripts from specific eras, and each of them, each of the fabulation and how we reinterpret things serves the agendas and the purposes of each of those generations.
Mm-hmm. And maybe
Um,
different factions
but
today. So
yeah,
I see
but
this helps LDS theology in general of why the Book of Mormon is needed, because we do teach that there are mistranslations in the Bible. And is that what you're meaning, or is there something more specifically about the Book of Mormon that this
well,
helps?
in the case of apologists for the Book of Mormon, it pretty much ends with them saying, "You see, here we have a biblical expert who says that the original manuscripts do not agree. They have discrepancies. They have errors in them." Because that, of course, that's the whole motivation in the um, in the grand narrative of Joseph Smith praying to God to reveal which one was correct, and then the Book of Mormon
Which
takes
denomination? Yeah.
but it stops there.
Yeah, and I know,
Very
like, as I was taught, one of the things, that happened in Joseph's first vision experience
yeah,
where, God and Jesus revealed themselves to him, is that there were precious things, taken out, and that basically all the current
mm,
creeds were an abomination. But that in itself was
right,
actually, not there are many accounts of that vision, you know,
yeah,
so that
yeah,
detail came at a point when it mattered to theology, so, yeah.
exactly, yeah.
Alright.
So let's
And
go
in the
ahead and
King
apply.
in the King Follett
Go ahead.
sermon, Joseph Smith says, "Oh, here we have an old monk must have, squirreled something into the Bible, right?" And
Yeah,
my son recently said that there's no such thing as anything like that, because there are so many scraps of manuscripts and here and there scattered
yeah.
around. You can tell when somebody inserts something in 400 AD or 600
Mm.
AD, or
Yeah. Yes, but
and
Yeah.
so
could you in 1844? Could
No.
you in 1844? Probably not. I mean, that
Yeah.
kind of work had been going on in Germany
no, but you'd have
for
to make up a whole
a
slew of
long
new
time.
prophets that you
Yeah,
just
yeah,
recently discovered.
Yeah.
yeah. Amazing how that works, isn't it?
Yeah, in your
So
backyard.
here, yeah, in Ohio. So here, we've got these two the problems with these two legends. These are fabulations. Um, and the reason they're fabulations has to do with the people involved in producing the theater. Because one thing that uh, LDS tradition does have a tendency to do is to erase people. So we're going to go on and into to the next animation, and we are going to take a look at who got erased. Well, there's this guy named Thomas Ackley Line. He was born in 1806 and he died in 1890. Um, he was not a lifelong Mormon. He was converted by his brother-in-law, George Jones Adams, in 18 1844, but it was a long conversion. And the reason that George Adams, and by the way, Maven and Jean, have you heard the name George Adams before?
Only if I heard you say it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
George J. Adams, everyone should Google him, and everyone should go to the Joseph Smith papers and do a search for him.
okay.
George Jones Adams was an extremely close associate of Joseph Smith, right up until the moment that he was excommunicated.
Huh.
And then
That's
he was the,
interesting
then he
then
was,
that we've never like Gina and
yeah,
I can't like place him.
yeah,
Yeah.
because these folks get erased from Mormon history.
Hmm.
But to the credit of the compilers of the history of the church, you can still find him in the history of the church. You can find Thomas Ackley Line in the history of the church, because what happened fatefully sometime after 1835 was that Thomas Ackley Line, who was a rising star on the New York stages, married the sister of George J. Adams. The sister, Mercy Adams, was an actress. And neither Tom nor Mercy were Mormon. Um, and neither was George until February of 1840, when he and his wife Caroline moved to New York City. And they just happened, for reasons that were never explained. We don't know why these two Methodists, because George Adams was a failed Methodist minister at this point. He went to a sermon that was being given by none other than Heber Chase Kimball. And so he says that he was convicted of the truth of the Mormon gospel on the spot, and he was baptized, and he became, within a matter of weeks, George Adams became the founder of a Mormon stake in Brooklyn. And he set about trying to convert his brother-in-law, Tom Line. And his brother-in-law had no interest in this religion that he could not fathom. Baptism for the dead. All of these are
Golden
are
plates.
I'm sorry.
You probably couldn't fathom golden plates either.
Not golden plates either. George Adams wrote several. He was a prolific writer as well as a compelling speaker. He wrote pamphlets on the in defense of Mormonism. He wrote something on the baptism for the dead. He replaced Parley P. Pratt in the British mission. So he was away from Brooklyn for 2 years. And during those 2 years, Tom Line decided, um, okay, sure, I'll give it a shot. I'm not making any money in New York anyway. So I'm going to go to Nauvoo, and I'm going to see whether or not this is true. But that wasn't the main reason he was going to Nauvoo. Nauvoo just happened to be on the Mississippi, and the Mississippi happened to be where the theatrical troupe that he had joined was touring. So he leaves his wife, Mercy. Her brother, George, comes back from England and is immediately called back to Nauvoo because he's been accused of adultery, um, and he's summoned to Nauvoo. So he and Tom Line end up in Nauvoo at the same time, probably because they had been keeping track of each other through letters. And in 1843, um, he looks at Tom Line looks around Nauvoo and thinks, wow, there's no theater here. We could actually make a lot of
Opportunity.
money. Yeah, there's an opportunity here. And he runs that by George, and George says, I have the perfect thing.
I thought
What
you were
you
going to say
need to
George said, "By Tom, you're right." Because by George, you're right.
by George, by George, by Tom, all of that happened. We can turn that into our fabulation, Gene. That
That's
could be
right.
the new story. So I'll leave that to you to transcribe. Would you transcribe it on plates for me if you would?
Will.
So
And you know, this is an example of why, and I'm going to refer, and we'll have in the description your presentation on Mormonism Live, the Ouija board baptisms.
the Ouija board baptisms, yes.
So once you gave that presentation,
Yeah.
I started to think to myself, that's just the tip of the iceberg of all the things that Lee has on his mind, right? This is just an example of something. And so then when Maven was able to connect with you more at the beginning of this year, I said to Maven, there's got to be at least, 5 shows that we can do with Lee. And we're finally doing one.
Okay.
And we'll probably do a whole one on Thomas Ackley Line and his brother George. I mean, his brother-in-law George, right?
Yeah, right.
And so anyway, so the problem. What's the problem again?
The problem is that, well, here's the problem, and we'll go ahead and end this discussion, this episode, on this point. This used to be a database called Mormon Pioneer Overland Travel. This is no longer the name of the database. It's been folded into another one. This used to be Tom Line's bio on the Mormon website.
Yeah,
On
little is
the
known.
Latter-day
It's
Saints.
all we knew
Little
about
is
him.
known about him until 1862. And I thought, I know a whole lot about Tom Line before 1862. And why would that be? That this is all we know about him. So over the last 30 years, from March 1993 until present time, I have spent digging to see what was not only what was before 1862, but why the fact that he spent the last 30 years of his life in Salt Lake City, most of them feuding with Brigham Young, why then do producers of theater among the Latter-day Saints not know anything about him?
But they know that Joseph Smith started theater in Nauvoo.
Right. and not the real guy. So we will the next time we get together, we will begin our discussion with that point.
All right. Is this
There you
I
go.
think the end of the slides, or is there a couple of more?
Oh, there are lots more slides, but
Oh,
why
okay.
don't we save them for next time?
Okay.
Right.
We'll put a pin in it here.
Well,
Yeah.
thanks,
All right.
Maven, for co-hosting. Thanks, Lee,
Thank
for
you,
coming on the
Maven.
show.
Thank you, Gene.
Yeah.
So wait, so
I'm
just our cliffhanger then is why did this happen? And
yes.
then that's what we'll get into.
Why was he erased? Why was he fabulated
That's right.
out of
Yes.
the story, out of the narrative?
I'm
I'll
guessing
say,
it's not something small. I'm guessing there's and I'm not guessing because I had a conversation with you about this story. And I'll just go ahead and say there is some
Yeah.
tea, there is some drama. So if
that's
that's
right.
the kind of stuff you like, that's what we're going to
This
get into.
is not the end of the line.
Yes.
No, the line that we're drawing the line here. The line forms here.
That's right.
Okay,
This is
All
just the
right.
beginning of the
I'm gonna
line.
stop.
Okay, yeah. Well, and you'll have until next time to come up with more line puns.
That's
Oh,
right. We
I
don't
think
want to get lines
Gene
disease.
will have done that long before I reach the conversation.
There you go.
All
Thanks
right.
a lot, everybody, for watching. Like and subscribe. We're going to have a lot more Lee heading our way soon. Everybody have a great rest of the year, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.